What's missing here is there was supposed to be another diagram there, which is of a quadcopter, which is the standard configuration of the smaller drones that are used on the battlefield. So when we're talking about drones, I'm not getting into the details of individual drones. This one flies 21 kilometers, this one does 22, this one weighs 1.5 kilograms, this one doesn't, this one has this camera, this one doesn't. What I'm doing is breaking them up into two major categories. Strategic, so think of drones that hit Kiev, or tactical, which are small quadcopter drones, for the most part, not exclusively, that are used on the battlefield. And in fact, although the Shahed drones are the ones that often get into the press, what excites the pundits and the analysts are the smaller drones, which I don't have an image here, but I will later on. So part of the technical details, I have to point at him or tell him to go to the next slide. Next slide. Now I'm going to put in a caveat on this presentation. You might think I'm copping out. That's okay, because I am. The war between Russia and Ukraine is not perfectly analogous to contingencies that NATO may face in the future. And not every lesson in Ukraine is applicable to NATO's military planning or their tactics. But this war is nonetheless full of instructive technological innovations. So all I'm doing is I'm giving you a heads up that whatever we think we're learning from Ukraine may or not be true and applicable to NATO forces. Next. So the format for this presentation is an introduction, historical context, and yes, drones do have a history. Warfighting context, centered on the Russia-Ukrainian war, even though it's not over yet. I'm going to try to bring this all to a conclusion. It would be tempting, in a military sense, to talk about lessons learned. So here's a lesson learned from drones being used this way. I'm not going to do that, because the war in Ukraine is not over. It may change. What I am going to do is to make a general observation. I will make several of these as we go through the presentation, of what I think could be a lesson learned and would still be sound if I'm right. I think I'm at least 80% right. And the fact that they're general also helps. So be aware of that. I also want to, as part of my aim, is reduce some of the hype that is out in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, television journalists reporting on drone usage, etc., etc. And I want to introduce a dose of reality into drone warfare. Next. So what exactly is a drone? That sounds like a simple question. It's actually not, but this is the most commonly accepted definition. An unmanned aerial vehicle. And that tells you I'm not going to talk about naval drones. I'm not going to talk about ground drones. I'm only going to talk about aerial drones, so we don't have the time or the space to go into that sort of depth. It's also important to understand that early drones were pre-programmed. They were not even pilotless. They had predetermined routes and altitudes, then they returned to base, usually recovered by a parachute. Remotely piloted drones, or what we see now, almost 100%, are flown through a computer screen, a tablet, or even a smartphone, and it makes them very flexible. Next. But you will hear in the newspapers and on television, drones will change the very nature of war. Drones will be a game changer. They will be a war winner. Drones will revolutionize warfare. These are exaggerations. They're good for selling books. They're good for selling TV time. They're not necessarily true. We're going to address these three bold statements during this presentation. Drones have certainly become a standing fixture in the Russia-Ukraine war, and many wars before. We used drones extensively in Afghanistan, for example, which is now 15 years ago. And in fact, so there's quite a history to it, but this first statement here, I'm going to cover it right now, because change the very nature of war. The nature of war actually has an official definition. It is change, it is uncertainty, it is the fog of war, and it is basically things that you can't plan for, But change itself is part of the nature of war. So if you're flying a drone and you think you're changing the nature of war, you're not, because change is the nature of war, and thus inventions like drones. And when we're talking about the nature of war, we're really talking about innovation. Think of innovation of new ideas, new inventions, but also adopting old ideas and old inventions. Perfect example, 2001, 9/11, when the airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center. That was a bunch of terrorists who cleverly adopted existing technology of a commercial airliner and turned it into a cruise missile. So that was something already existing. The other two, game changer and revolutionized warfare, we'll touch later. So historical context. Drones do have a history. They're not a new invention from last weekend. This is the first drone I could find. It's called the Kettering bug. Notice the similarity of word bug and drone. Its official title is an unmanned, or an experimental unmanned aerial torpedo. Pretty good name. It was being tested by the Americans in October 1918. It was moving towards being successfully implemented. The war ended, and they packed up all their bags and they went home and forgot all about it. It was going to be maneuvered by a gyroscope and have 82 kilograms of explosive in it. It's basically a cruise missile with bi-wings. Would be 15 feet wingspan, 12 feet long. Too small to put a man in. So that's your first drone, if you will. But leaping ahead into the Second World War, Hitler's Wunderwaffe, his wonder weapons. This one, the V-1 buzz bomb. That is effectively a cruise missile. It is also a drone because it uses a gyroscope, or a compass rather, in the head of the missile, and then it uses stabilizers on the wings. So it flies a definite course, flies a definite distance. And of course they were used on London. But unfortunately for Adolf Hitler, they were not a war winner. They were just another weapon to be used. They didn't change the course of World War II. He was passionate, Hitler was, about those wonder weapons. He thought they would make the difference. They didn't. Next comes my first observation. This is actually called O'Mara's Law from the Rand Corporation. We tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And of course, long run can be decades. It's not 3 months or 4 months. It's 10, 40, 50 years before you see the effects. Some years ago, we had something called the Revolution in Military Affairs, up to about the year 2000. That was supposed to revolutionize warfare. It was supposed to eliminate the fog of war. It didn't. So many of these things get a lot of hype. They don't end up being as successful as some people hoped they would be. But here's something that was moderately successful. Drones over Vietnam. This is what is known as a lightning bug. There's that word bug again. Drone, bug. Lightning bug drones were used in Vietnam in lieu of U-2 spy planes. No pilot, no landing gear, much smaller. And they were used to fly over North Vietnam. They were quite successful in what they were required to do. They took bullets when the U-2s that they could have flown over North Vietnam didn't have to, because they put cameras in these things. And in fact, they even put fuel tanks. And eventually, they never tried them in combat. They were putting missiles and bombs on them. So they were fairly effective. And they were cheap, about $150,000 each one of these. If you lose it, we get another one. Now, of course, we got much more sophisticated kind of drones. And, as stated here, there may be such a thing as a cheap airplane, but there is no such thing as a cheap American pilot, or any other nationality for that matter. Here's the latest version of a drone. You'll notice all the hard points it's got. It's got 2, 3, it's got 6 munitions on it. So it can carry bombs, lasers, whatever you want. It's basically a small airplane. There's the missile, very accurate. The limitation, however, is they were good in Afghanistan, but they have to exist in a permissive environment. So in other words, as soon as you put something up that could shoot them down, whether it's from the ground or an aerial vehicle, they got problems. Now the Houthis have managed to shoot down quite a few of these over Yemen. But they're only $25 million apiece, which isn't exactly the best way to do things, but it does make a point. It's a lot better than losing a pilot. So, very successful, used them in Afghanistan, because of course the Taliban had nothing. They couldn't shoot them down, they couldn't do anything about them. And all you can get from them, you can't see them, is you can hear a hum overhead. So you know they're in the air and they're looking for you. Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, and I would challenge anyone who's probably ever heard of this war. War between Armenia and, what was the name of the country? Right, you've heard of it, testing it. Azerbaijan. Very successful, but partially because the Armenians weren't really expecting it. But it carries laser-guided missiles and bombs, very successful, and basically is considered to be the weapon system most predominant and most contributory to winning the war for Azerbaijan. They were also used at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. They are now no longer being used because they are too vulnerable. They were not detectable by radar in 2020. Now they are, and they would be blown out of the sky. So the Ukrainians used them, but they used them away from the front line where they'll be shot down. So if they were flying it over the Black Sea, they might use one, something like that. But that's how fast things change. So that's kind of the introduction. So let's go into a warfighting context here, which is the types of drones you're going to see in Ukraine in general categorization. So drones are not new, as I've illustrated, and have a much longer history in combat than you might think. So now we're going to look at how they're being used in a warfighting context now, in the Russia-Ukrainian war, and think of strategic and or tactical. And the picture didn't come out. That was the picture at the front that didn't come out for whatever reason. So what's known as a quadcopter. You'll see some later on. Actually have 4 little wings with a helicopter-type blade on the top of each of the 4 wings. So strategic drone, this is what hits the cities in Ukraine. Carries 50-kilogram warhead, can carry bigger, can fly low, can fly high, all basically pre-programmed. Tactical drone will actually have a pilot somewhere else actually moving it. So Russian strikes against Ukraine, just to illustrate what the Russians are doing. The name of it is Garan 2. It originally was an Iranian missile, if you want to call it, or drone, and they've improved it substantially, and they're building 1,250 a month, 2024. They claim to be building 2,000 a month in 2025. Their goal is to have 6,000 per month by the end of this year. Are they achieving that goal? They won't tell me. I have no idea. So these are just estimates out in the open air, if you will. They can fly it low and high, but they cost about $80,000, one of those, with a 50-kilogram bomb in the nose. They also produce decoys. So if you shoot down one, it may not be one of the ones carrying a bomb. It may be one that's not carrying a bomb. But it has the same radar signature, and it's designed deliberately that way. Now, 10% of them got through in 2024. Actually, they hit their target. The other 90%, or 90% were shot down. They're now at 20% hitting their targets, and 80% get shot down. Why? Because they're building more and more of them. So they're getting through the Ukrainian air defenses because they don't have enough missiles and guns and whatever they're using to shoot them all down. And here's an example of one that's shot down. It's a Russian Garan 2 drone, exactly the same, much bigger picture. It gives you an idea of scale because you can see the people. It's about 12 feet across, maybe 10 or 11 feet long. Russian built, modified. They took what the Iranians had made and made it even better. Now this one has been shot down, which leads us to the question, shot down by what exactly? Well, there are several options. But the most likely one that shot this down is this. And this is the Gepard, mounted in an old German Leopard 1 tank with twin 35mm guns, its own radar system. Radar has a range of 14 kilometers. The guns have a range of 4 to 5 kilometers. This is what helps shoot down those Russian big drones when they try to hit Kiev. Very effective, but the Ukrainians only have about 100 of them. They probably could put them in the front line to shoot down the smaller drones, which we'll get to, but they'd inevitably get destroyed, and there's no replacement. They don't make these anymore. Very effective. But this leads us to what I'll call our second observation. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And that comes courtesy of Sir Isaac Newton. And really what it means is for every weapon you throw out there, there's going to be a countermeasure or a counter weapon against that. The Gepard being an example of shooting down those drones that the Russians are sending in against Kiev. So there's a counter weapon or a countermeasure. So if the idea is if you invent a tank, I invent a bigger anti-tank gun. If you invent a bigger tank, I get an even bigger anti-tank gun. And the technological thing goes along. But there's a degree of parity that happens. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. You get to the point where you're not getting ahead. In other words, you get ahead by having technological superiority. You don't get ahead by having the same technological superiority as the other guy does, because now it's two minds fighting, because your weapons tools are basically the same. Eventually, both sides adapt countermeasures or counterweapons, which helps to level out the playing field. And here's an example of what you can shoot down drones with. Now, I put an S here, or a T. S is for strategic, T is for tactical. So F-16 fighters are going to shoot down those big Russian drones that are flying 1,000 kilometers, as opposed to electronic jamming, which can do against strategic or tactical. And that's what that differentiation means. If you're not sure what the term means, think far, think close. So F-16 fighters can shoot down strategic drones. They can use surface-to-air missiles. They can use Gepard, which we showed you a photograph of. Vehicle-mounted machine guns can be useful, a little low altitude. Electronic jamming can work against both because they don't have pilots in them. They have to use electronic signals. Interceptor drones becoming increasingly important. Now about 20% of all of the Russian strategic drones are brought down by interceptor drones. By that I mean you crash your interceptor into the Russian drone and you bring it down if you can catch it. Finally, guys using tactical drones, you can radio triangulate where their little cell is and controlling their drones and hit them. Okay? Then the drones don't have any control. Now, these are basically active countermeasures, which also have passive. And I know this looks funny. It's a porcupine tank. Pretty correct name. You can see what it's got is not hair. It's not a bad hair day. It's got basically rebar that has been bent all over the top of this armored recovery vehicle. So the Russians would go out to recover one of their tanks, knowing full well they'd be attacked by drones, and all this helps to ward off the drones and allow them to successfully complete their mission. So think of it as the missiles and the planes, that's active defense. This is passive defense. But this is the kind of adaptive, battlefield, expedient innovation required in all wars, and in particular in this one. This doesn't come from a factory. This is a bunch of guys in the field saying, how do we protect ourselves when we drive out to pick out Bob in his broken down tank? And this is the idea they came up with. And it does work up to a point. So let's look at, that's the strategic drones. Let's look at tactical. ISR stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Basically, it's a radio-controlled airplane, but it has a camera in the front. And the cameras are often referred to as FPV, first-person view. That means the operator can stand with a computer screen and control the flight of that drone. They're not specifically built for war. They're right out of Radio Shack with batteries and whatnot. Therefore, they can be unreliable, and that's an issue. But they're cheap, $500 a pop. So you can buy hundreds of them, thousands of them if you need them. Now, what is changing is this. It's a fiber optic drone. Same as the one I just showed you. It's a quadcopter. Has a spool here, and you can't see it. There's a fiber optic cable comes out the back for a length of 20 kilometers. So this thing operates with an operator, okay, out to a maximum of 20 kilometers. Because the control goes down that little wire, it can't be jammed electronically. But it has a limitation on its range, And of course, that wire can be broken. It can be affected by water. If you want to go 21 kilometers, you can, but you crash because you've broken the cable. But this is the next stage, because people are trying to get away from the drones that can be jammed. That's an easy solution to dealing with drones. This one you can't jam, but it has limitations. And of course, you can put a bigger spool on it to 30 kilometers, 40, 50 kilometers. The problem is that weight affects the aerodynamics, slows down the speed, and of course if it's carrying a bomb or some sort of explosive, that reduces the weight of the explosive that it can carry. So there is a limitation, and they're more expensive. Not much more. It's also all of them are also very susceptible to high winds. They're very susceptible to snow, to rain. In other words, your drone might only weigh a couple of pounds, but a high wind would blow it away, and it would go somewhere else and never to be seen again. But that's the next generation of these smaller tactical drones that are being used on the front line. There are no aircraft really flying much in the area of the front line in Ukraine. They're flying in depth and launching missiles to hit a target. They're not flying over the battlefront. It's too risky. But these things can fly over the battlefront. Next. So this is a tactical bomber drone. And you can see it's quite big. It probably easily weighs about 60 pounds, as opposed to the previous ones might weigh 2 or 3 pounds. It's carrying some kind of 2 bombs here. However, because it's so big, it can be easily seen. So it's employed at night, which means it has to have special thermal cameras in order to be able to do that. However, it can carry a lot of things. It can carry these bombs. It can carry food packages. It can carry medical supplies. It can carry minelets for you to discover in the morning when you're going to the loo and stepping on a minelet that wasn't there last night, etc. So pretty effective, but not a lot of those around. So I've covered the main categories of drones in the battlefield, but I guess the question would be, how effective are they? Well, if you read the newspapers, drone warfare is one man, one drone, one target, one kill. No. It's not. The pundits will tell you that. The New York Times will tell you that, because they've got to sell newspapers. The more exciting your articles are, the better. And it fits in with one people think should be a robots first strategy. Robots, everything. Take your tanks, turn them into robots. Everything comes robots. But now comes a dose of reality for drone warfare in Ukraine. This is a Ukrainian drone team. First thing you should notice is there's 3 of them. Now, this is actually an artillery drone team. So there's a pilot, there is a flight engineer, and there is a navigator. That's 3. This one, because it's artillery, the drone they're using doesn't carry any explosives or any weapons, because they just want to see the target, call in artillery to hit that. So it's a little easier to use. But drones certainly need maintenance. These guys are an artillery team, but behind them is going to be people who, if they were using weapons, mount the weapons on a drone, connect to the artillery. The artillery's got to be in range of the targets you're trying to engage. And they also need maintenance. These are civilian-made drones. These are what you get when you go to Radio Shop. They break down. They're fragile. They're weak. They wear out. It is not one man, one drone. It is several men or ladies and one drone. It's more sophisticated than that. Now, I think I said there was a navigator. This is the navigator. Why the heck do you need a navigator? You're using some kind of television screen or whatever to fly the drone. What do you need a navigator for? Because there are no navigational aids in these drones. They're off the civilian shelf. So therefore, the navigator, he plots the course from the launch to the target, and he looks at the terrain, and he monitors that while the pilot actually flies it. No different than an aircraft you would have had 40 or 50 years ago, would have had a pilot and a navigator. And there's a reason for that. You need those 2 guys. So that makes your drone team bigger. This guy might be the pilot. This guy is basically kind of the flight engineer. He brings the drone, which guys are servicing in another location, and this guy is the navigator. And between the team, they fly and engage a target. Tanks are harder to kill At the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, they were easy to kill. You've probably seen lots of film footage where tanks are being seen from a drone view, and they're dropping a little bomb under a drone, and it goes right down the hatch, or it destroys the roof of the tank, or whatever. That is no longer the truth. Tanks are progressively harder to kill. I'll show you a picture in a moment. It now takes not 1 or 2, but 6 to 12 drone hits to disable or destroy a tank. It takes 70 drone hits to hit that porcupine thing I showed you. Remember the one with all the bad hair hanging out? That was destroyed. That one took 70 drone hits to destroy it. That's a lot of drone hits, and that's a lot of drone operators dedicating all the time to the destruction of one vehicle. So drones are now harder to kill. And finally, the cautious tank. There's no point in employing your tank at the front end of the battlefield if you're not going to use it, or it's going to attract drones to destroy it. Tanks are now way in the back where they can be used for counterattack or whatever. They're not close to the front anymore. Thus, the term cautious. And tanks are harder to kill. Next. The reality of drone warfare. Only 20 to 30% of all drones strikes hit the target. 20% can't fly due to weather. These drones cannot fly at night. Most of them don't have thermal cameras. They may be blown away in high winds. They may be, their cameras may be affected by snow, etc. They cannot fly at night, as I said. So there's limitations. And tech issues. Darn thing doesn't work. Go and get another drone before their target gets away. 20% can't fly due to weather and tech issues. 31% fly, but crash due to electronic jamming. 3% fly, but crash due to conflicting radio signals. I'm flying a drone, you're flying a drone. We're using the same radio signals. I said go left, you said go right, the drone, and it crashes. All right? Happens with the enemy too. If you're using frequency A and the enemy happens to be using frequency A as well, now both your drones can be affected by conflicting directions that you send if they're within range. Now some experts, a guy by the name of Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google, has boldly said that drones have now replaced artillery, infantry, anti-tank missiles, even airplanes. Well, how true is that? I think that tends to suggest something. Let's look at artillery next. Artillery versus drones. Artillery is more reliable. It's a proven and mature technology. Faster response, doesn't miss unless it wants to. Faster response means in under 2 minutes, you can have artillery rounds on almost any target as long as it's within range. A drone mission takes 15 minutes to mount cold. Now, if you're already flying around looking for targets, that's fine. But if you have to mount it cold, it'll take you 15 minutes. So it's better than a drone. Artillery can fire day and night. Drones can't do that. Only special drones can. Artillery can fire in all weathers. Drones can't do that. You can't jam artillery rounds. You can jam drones. Artillery rounds cannot be shot down. Artillery can launch defensive fire to protect objectives and put out smoke screens to screen our movement from the enemy. And artillery can illuminate targets at night. Drones can't do that. And artillery can immediately respond to counter battery. Against enemy artillery is going to be 20 or 25 kilometers away in 2 or 3 minutes. All other things being equal. Drones can't do that. They have to find that target and then go there, and it's probably moved. Next. So observation number 3. Artillery and mortars are still superior to drones alone. Drones should enable, but not replace artillery. So enable and enhance artillery. In other words, instead of having a forward observer sitting in a little foxhole, you could put your forward observer watching through the screen of a drone 20 kilometers away and then turn around and fly 20 kilometers somewhere else. Almost all targets in Ukraine can be engaged by artillery and done faster. So drones by themselves cannot win wars or battles. They need the traditional elements of artillery, infantry, and tanks to be successful. Nor can they hold or take ground all by themselves. But in Ukraine, 70% of all targets are destroyed by drones. 5 months ago, that would have been artillery. Well, that would suggest that drones are superior to artillery. Elon Musk thinks so. Not true. The reality is that they're not using their artillery as much because they don't control the supply of ammunition, which comes from Europe and the United States. If that was cut off, they'd be in trouble. But as we'll show you, the production numbers for drones, because remember these are little commercial or recreational style drones, might cost a few $100. They're easy to produce. There's 500 companies in Ukraine making drones. And we'll touch on production shortly. So drones are not better than artillery. They're replacing artillery because the Ukrainians are not using them as much due to shortages of ammunition. Drones are expendable. And you'll see how many drones they're making. It's literally doesn't matter. Launch as many drones as you need. But let's look at an example of drones in battle, in a tactical battle. Just recently, there was a Russian attack to try to take the city of Pokrovsk, on the Eastern Front, if you will, in the Donetsk Oblast or province. 11 to 31 August, so very recent, a Russian brigade made a deep penetration of Ukrainian lines, trying to encircle the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. However, the Russians, who were all on foot, outran their own artillery support, outran their drones and their supplies. So the Ukrainians, using tanks, because the Russians had no drones, artillery, and their own drones, in the integrated combined arms team, the Ukrainians counterattacked and basically defeated this threat to get behind Pokrovsk and encircle it, forcing, hopefully at some point, the surrender of that city. The Ukrainians were able to use tanks because there was no drones. The Russians literally outmarched their own drones. They were exclusively on foot. They may have had some drone teams, but how many drones can you carry? How many munitions or bombs can you carry? And the tablets, and radios, and your iPhone to look at the screen, and on it goes. Not very much. So if they did have drone teams, they wouldn't have lasted very long. Next. Observation number 4. Remember, these are not lessons. They're observations, probably will be lessons. Drones are now an integral part of combined arms teams, based on that counterattack from Pokrovsk. Note the drone cage. This is why it's so much more difficult to destroy tanks than it was in the past. There are none of these drone cages on tanks as late as 2023, when the Ukrainians were launching their counteroffensive. In the south, remember, this was the big chance they were going to have. They were going to take territory, maybe get into Crimea, etc., etc. If you look at the pictures of all the destroyed and damaged tanks, no drone cages. And that drone cage is easily 2 feet above. That's the weakest part of the tank, on the roof. So when a drone comes to drop its projectile or to crash into, like a kamikaze, into the top of the tank, that drone cage will help them. And that's why it's 6 to 12 hits on a tank to disable it, no longer 1 or 2. Drones cannot, I've not seen any evidence, hold ground by themselves. They cannot take ground by themselves. They need to be integrated with other combined arms of infantry, artillery, and armor. As such, I predict that they are just one more tool in the commander's toolbox, not the game changer or war winner that some journalists and people in the news will tell you. They're definitely not going away. So that leads us to those 3 questions. We answered the first question, I think. That change is the nature of war. So if you're introducing change, you're not changing the nature of war, you are the nature of war. Are drones a game changer or a war winner by themselves? I would say no. But, hedge my bets a little bit on observations, not lessons learned. So it may change, maybe, but I don't think so. I think it's unlikely. What I do think is that every country in the world is going to have these small drones. They already have the big drones that I showed you, the Reapers and the Predators that we used in Afghanistan. Those still exist. There's still a market for those, and those are vindicated in their usage on the battlefield under certain circumstances, generally permissive. Now the question is about little drones. So it's unlikely that any major country in the world is not going to have these smaller drones. And in fact, if you look, did anybody look at the parade that was shown on TV for China, their big parade they had in Beijing, and you looked at it, looked at all the parade of weapons. When you came to the part of drones, the emphasis was on countermeasures, lasers, microwave, guns to shoot down drones. They had very few of the quadcopters, and then they had the big drones that were like the Reapers, that would carry missiles that would be long-range strategic drones. So everybody's going to need drones of both big and small, but also the countermeasures that go with it. They're here to stay. But not changing the nature of war, not a game changer or a war winner. This leads us to another observation. New weapons must be assimilated into tactics, doctrine, and organization. In order to reach the full combat potential of drones, small or large, there needs to be a consolidation of best practices through the production of tactical manuals, standard operating procedures, and doctrine. And the Ukrainians are leading in this at the moment. They have created a new innovative organization called the Unmanned Systems Forces. Next. This is a translation of the Ukrainian statement of purpose. Dedicated, unmanned military branch, employing pilotless aircraft, ground-based robotic systems, and marine surface and subsurface drones at the tactical and strategic levels. Aim to gather experience, disseminate knowledge, and formalize insights into statutes, tactical, operational guidelines, as I said, standard operating procedures, tactical manuals, doctrine. But let's take a little leap here and look at drone production. I have no idea whether these, sorry, next slide please. These numbers are correct. They probably are, probably close, but that's the disadvantage. The war is not over. We don't have access to information. But look at the numbers of the Ukrainians. This is per month. They're hoping to get to 375,000 drones per month by the end of 2025, as are the Russians. That's 4.5 million drones. But if you want to question the utility of drones, you can ask yourself one question. If last year they killed maybe 100,000 Russians, killed and wounded 100,000 Russians, but they fielded 2.5 million drones, it's not one man, one drone, one target, one kill. A lot of those things miss. And if you look at the other side, I think I said 25% actually miss the target completely. Don't even hit it. So these are the production figures that they're looking at. One of the reasons they're doing this is they don't have anything else. The Air Force is not working too well. So in essence, drones have now become ammunition. Quite literally, there's the ammunition, there's the drone carrying the ammunition and delivering it to a target. Ukraine has over 500 companies building drones. Probably the Russians are not far behind. Canada, if you look, probably find 20 or 30, but they are cheap, they're easy to build, can expand very fast. Next. So this brings us to a conclusion. And this weapon system is, you remember the Gepard I showed you at the beginning was a tank with the twin 35 millimeter guns on it? Well, that's an old system, 1980s or something. This is its replacement. It's called Sky Ranger. 30 millimeter rapid fire cannon, small missiles, radars on other separate vehicles, and the Germans are planning to build regiments of these. So it goes to show you that for every weapon there is an equal and counter weapon. And in fact, what everybody is doing in the West in NATO is making sure they have the countermeasures first before they're worried about the offensive weapons. And that was illustrated in that parade when the Chinese laid out all their weapons. There was lots of stuff on lasers, microwaves, gun systems, all countermeasures against drones. So this will be the future for Gepard. This will be able to shoot down strategic drones, but also the smaller tactical drones as well. And microwaves will do that. Lasers, those are all coming. So this brings us back to those three questions or three statements that I issued at the beginning. We've dealt with the change the very nature of war. Change is the nature of war. I've told you, you may not agree, but drones are not a game changer or a war winner by themselves. The last question is, will they revolutionize warfare? Well, use of those larger drones as either a crude cruise missile or like the Reapers and the Predators that we used extensively in Afghanistan, and they were very, very successful, in a permissive environment. They are vindicated. We'll continue to use them or whatever the next iteration of them is. The quadcopters, the small tactical drones, I don't believe they're revolutionary. I think they're evolutionary. Because we were using, in Afghanistan in 2008, we were testing a lot of the little drones, experimenting to see how utility they could be. And that's why I say evolutionary versus revolutionary. So my answer to the last question is no, but drones are here to stay. Drones are here to stay, big ones, and drones are here to stay, little ones. And in fact, I think I'll leap ahead a little bit here. I'm not going to change the slide, but the problems with drones are, and what you're told by journalists in the press, is that, and they often use the term game changer, revolutionized warfare, et cetera, which I'm trying to explain to you that there's a lot of hype that goes with that, and it's not quite true. It may change things, small c, but it's not changing things in a big way and becoming a war winner. Is that the war in Ukraine has certainly confirmed the utility of big drones and also small drones. So every country in the world is going to have those small drones. But will they have them to the same magnitude as the Ukrainians and the Russians? 75,000 drones a month? I suspect not, because I think when we get all our countermeasures going, of lasers, of microwave, of guns, in a multi-layered approach, we're going to blow a lot of those drones out of the sky. They will still be there. They will still be utility. They will still be utilized. But they're not going to be what some people are trying to sell you, which is change the very nature of war. Be a game changer, war winner, revolutionize war. Oh, by the way, have you seen my book? Yeah. That's what it's really for. They have confirmed that. So this brings me to my final observation. Technological advantage in war is the most fleeting advantage of all. Once you gain an advantage over your enemy, for example, if the Ukrainians started with the drones first, the Russians might be in some ways institutionally inept, they might be corrupt, they are not stupid. They duplicate everything. If they see a good idea by the Ukrainians, like the United Systems Forces, they've built their own now. So they look at what the Ukrainians do and say, yeah, that's a good idea, let's do that. So they duplicate it, they're just a little farther behind. So if you rely exclusively on a technological advantage, as the Ukrainians often say they are, the advantage of our drones versus their drones, that advantage can easily be peeled away and disappeared. Modern successful fighting forces need parity in technology and innovation, which isn't always technological, superiority if you can get it for as long as you can get it. But at the beginning, I think I mentioned Adolf Hitler and his wonder weapons. None of those weapons changed World War II. Jet fighters, ME-262s, V-1 buzz bombs, V-2 rockets, because they either didn't have enough of them or there wasn't enough that was going to make a difference to get the Western Allies to back off. He banked everything on technology. It is a mistake to bank on our technological superiority is going to win the war for us. What it probably will result is you'll get technological parity between two sides, between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and you'll get what? A stalemate. What do we have now? Kind of a stalemate. May not last, but we have a stalemate. And that means that other factors, superiority of infantry forces, superiority of artillery, both numbers and quality, superiority of tanks, or any other weapon situation, tactics, doctrine, those sorts of things may very well make the difference between winning and losing in a war, but not a narrow, short-term technological advantage. Last slide, please. Before I take questions, I'm going to explain this. This is the Italian army in St. Peter's Square of the Vatican. This is an anti-drone team. It consists of 3 men. This man is carrying a jamming rifle, an electronic warfare jammer. So it operates on a multitude of frequencies. So if you spot a drone, you aim your jammer rifle at it, you jam it, and it crashes. This man is the spotter with the binoculars. He's looking for drones. This man is the final backup. If you can't jam the drone, you're going to try and shoot it down. But the point being is that everybody understands the utility and importance of drones. Everywhere you go, people are using drones. and or the countermeasures against drones. And oh, by the way, our base in Latvia, our Brigade Minus in Latvia, they don't have drones, but they have countermeasures, microwave, they have detectors. So everybody is getting into that. The minimum you've got to have is the countermeasures. Then you can always branch out into drones if you want. So that's the end of my presentation. Try and answer your questions, understanding that I can only access open source information. So if you ask me, what are the Russians doing about, I don't know. But I'll try and answer your questions, and we can talk a bit about Canadian drones. So, please, your questions.
I always have questions.
Charlotte.
In particular,
Yeah, so everybody can hear you.
so in particular, looking at that kamikaze drone,
Yeah.
is there going to be like, or possibly be an increase of like unexploded ordnance, like when the war ends, if there's these drones, maybe they miss their target, or like the case of that one, it doesn't even look like it can just come back if it didn't do its job.
It's a kamikaze. It's a suicide drone.
Yeah. So with the increase in drone warfare, is there then going to be like an increase in unexploded ordnance
Yes.
at the end of the war?
Yeah.
And is it an increase in comparison to like artillery, for example?
It would be an increase compared to artillery, because artillery has a lower dud rate. The Russian dud rate is about 20 to 30%. We would be maybe a couple of percent. But basically, yes, the more ordnance you have out there, the more risk, even mines. I think Ukraine is the most mined country in the world, because the Russians are big on mines, and they didn't sign the mine warfare agreement. They weren't interested in that, and maybe rightly so. So yes, there will be more ordnance on the battlefield, so they will take, if the war ended tomorrow morning or this afternoon, it would take literally years to get rid of all that stuff. Now, they are doing it now. There are places where there are ordnance already lying around. As you recall, the Russians withdrew from a lot of the territory in the north. So the Ukrainians are in. They have teams going in to pick up, the ordnance and dispose of it and whatnot. So it's ongoing. They're not wasting any time. Did I answer your question? Pretty much. Hugh.
Scott, in terms of the cat versus mouse picture that you painted us, I'm wondering about the cost differential. Are we, for example, having a $10,000 missile shooting down a $500 drone? I mean, at the end of the day, those costs are going to factor in. How does that cost ratio work?
Well, that's a good point, because I mentioned all the countermeasures that were basically defensive, covering Kiev, for example, fighter planes, surface-to-air missiles, et cetera, machine guns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Using a surface-to-air missile like a Patriot, which costs $3 million, to knock down one of those big Russian drones, which cost about $80,000, is not cost-effective or sustainable in the long term. If you've got $100 million and you've got $100 million and you go out and buy all Patriot missiles, I'm going to have a lot more drones to get, after you've already used all your Patriot missiles, to hit your targets. So yes, there is an issue with sustainability and cost. Although the Ukrainians are given a lot of weapons, there is a limitation to that, because clearly Germany and France and the United States are not going to give up everything they have, and their production runs are small. And somebody was talking about Excalibur munition, which is an artillery round which uses GPS to hit a target. The Americans build it. They only build 1,000 rounds a year. So that would just disappear in Ukraine. It's to be all gone. So yes, the Ukrainians are very sensitive to that. They want Patriot. Patriot is very accurate. It's very reliable. But it's $3 million a missile. And that may not cost them any money, although now that, for the most part, they're supposed to buy their stuff from Europe. That's the restriction that Trump has put on them. If Trump gives it to them, they're free, but there's limitation in numbers. The Americans now have to go out and buy more in order to have Patriot missiles in their stock. So yes, you're absolutely correct. There is a cost ratio problem. Yeah.
In terms of people, so the thing of the unmanned military branch.
It is manned, by the way. It's the equipment that's unmanned.
So the vehicles are unmanned.
Yeah.
So when you're doing the research here, what makes a good drone pilot, both for the large and the small? For instance, would you see a company of unmanned people making reserve unit from the local drone float, etc.? So what makes good drone pilots and drone counter-measure personnel?
Okay, the answer to that question is actually, it goes to the in-depth of the Ukrainian army, how it's organized. They run a lot of their stuff like a tech startup. That means if you are successful in your tech startup, you downed more tanks or whatever, you get more money and more drones and more resources and more people. So the good units are reinforced, the poor units are starved. The problem is, if you think of the Vietnam War and body counts, who's to say, who's to check that when a unit is reporting great success, who's to establish that it's correct? Because of course, once a unit gets deprived of resources, they're really going to go to almost any length to get those resources, if for no other reason than to protect their own people. But they all right now predominantly run all their own training, which is a problem. It's very inconsistent. It's not integrated. There is no doctrine. The Unmanned Systems Forces is trying to address that, but not all unmanned systems units report to unmanned systems forces. The Navy and the Air Force have their own brigades, for good reason, of drone units. They don't report to USF. USF is kind of an Army unit. But it sits on a par with the Army, Navy, and Air Force. That's how important it is. But the people who are the best, supposedly, at being pilots are video game players, mostly guys. But for women, it's women who like to sew and knit. Because it's using your fingers. And it's the dexterity in your fingers that allows you to maneuver that drone carefully and well in battle and dropping bombs on targets and whatnot. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bill.
Would you care to comment on a recent development called the Winchester drone? It's got a pair of shotguns on it, and it hunts down individual troopers.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that one. I know the Ukrainians experimented with putting AK-47s and machine guns and things underneath the drone, and then it would go and attack a dismounted infantry or whatever. But my impression is it's not a very good idea because you have limited ammunition. You're probably expecting more out of it. You're more likely to get misses from shooting machine guns than you are dropping bombs, which you can get vertically. So if you were armed with a couple of shotguns, how would you recock the shotgun? You wouldn't. How would you recock the shotgun?
As I understand it, there's 3 shot per barrel, 2 barrels, and so you got 6 rounds. And they've been using them for hunting down stragglers and loose infantry. There's video of them. The drone gets within 5 or 6 feet of the victim and fires.
Well, that's probably why they're being used to hunt up deserters and people leaving the lines when they shouldn't be using them. I think the problem with them is their limitation of what they can do. I think you're better off bombing from altitude, so to speak, by dropping hand grenades or bomblets or minelets or something like that, rather than getting low enough to shoot. Because if you're low enough to shoot at them, they can shoot at you. Now, drones are hard to bring down, but I could see that being more used for deserters than, as you indicated, than on the front line. But there's no limit to what you can put under a drone if you wish. I mean, they have done a few with machine guns, but they tend to disappear after a while. They don't seem to come back. They seem to like the bombing aspect. So that would be my answer. So, yeah.
Scott, I was just wondering, the people have observed right from the beginning of these wars, particularly Ukraine, about air superiority, in particular even the focus now, even in North America, on the Golden Dome. So how would you have factored in if they had provided air superiority, or even some of the Golden Dome that Israel has, type of thing, that the difference that would have made in the whole nature of the war as far as the change that would happen based on that? Because you've never mentioned about air superiority in this process, and I was just wondering, what air superiority would have done for Ukraine.
Well, I think that's a good question. And right now you don't have air superiority by either side. The Russians have the bigger air force. The Ukrainians have a small air force. They do operate behind the lines. You may have heard of glide bombs, where they basically toss the bomb, wings snap out on the side, and it's basically just the momentum of the jet will throw that bomb, and you can, to a certain degree, guess where it's going to land, but it's good for area targets. Neither side has air superiority. The really only thing they have is drones. So think of it almost as a poor man's Air Force. The reason they don't do that is neither side can afford to lose the planes. Now the Russians have 500, 600, 700 aircraft. They only build 30 or 40 aircraft a year. They probably lose, even under those circumstances, 30 or 40 aircraft a year. They can't afford to lose more. The Ukrainians are in a similar boat, and of course all their aircraft come from the West. And if the West says, gee, we ran out of aircraft, then that source is gone. So they don't want to risk their aircraft anywhere near the front. And that's why I refer to it sort of as a poor man's Air Force. So you think of everything from about 20 kilometers forward and back of your front line is going to be dominated by drones. So no aircraft going to fly in that zone unless they're extremely high altitude. They're going to be back in the rear, and they're going to lob these glide bombs at you, and that's how they're going to operate. Minimize the possibility of being shot down, and maintain that aircraft for numerous mission cycles.
And the Ukrainian Golden Dome?
Well, they want more Patriots. They just got two more Patriot systems from Germany. They're using them all exclusively on the Shahed Garand 2 type drones because, as I indicated earlier on, in 2024, the Russians were breaking through about 10% of their drones were getting through and hitting a target. 2025, it's now gone to about 20%. That doesn't mean it'll go up again. It might, but it's a bad trend. So they want those Patriots to shoot down drones over Kiev and Odessa. They don't want them for at the front line. So I don't see much changing. However, if NATO was to fight Russia, we would have air superiority. And we would probably beat the hell out of the Russian Air Force. It just wouldn't last very long. Because we'd have aircraft to reach in depth. We'd be able to replace it. The production capacity is much larger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So neither side has air superiority, except in drones, and that's kind of almost a parity. I think at the best, the Ukrainians might have a slight air superiority in drones, but it shifts back and forth very quickly, so it's hard to measure.
Question about logistics. So some of the reports that I've seen indicate the Russians have gone from supplying their front line with military trucks to civilian vehicles to ATVs, and now they're stuck with scooters because anything that moves. And your comment about tanks can be protected in the rear. The problem with logistics is that you need stuff moving all the time. Is that not where the real focal point of drones can be have the greatest impact? Is you can make a breakthrough, but you can't supply it because they just swamp the zone with drones.
And that's basically what happened at Pokrovsk, although that may have been an opportunistic, because there's nobody in the front line, they just sent guys through. They couldn't take anything with them. So I would say, yes, logistics. They're often talking about logistics, and something I didn't touch on is the drone wall. The Ukrainians and the Russians will duplicate this, want to build a drone wall that's in belts in forward of their front line. So at 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, they don't have 40, 50, and 100 kilometers, there will be drones that control those belts, and nothing will move inside that belt without being engaged or spotted by drones and engaged with artillery fire. In which case, yes, logistics becomes a real issue. And they do have that. Increasingly, they're using ground drones to move up supplies to the front line because you don't have people. You don't have to feed the people who are driving the drones. You can drive the drones, go into a hide, wait for nightfall, sneak out again, go into another hide. You can do that kind of thing. But yes, it's an issue for both sides. Yeah, Frank.
An observation. First of all, I'll say that if you're looking for a good drone pilot, I think you're looking for a real nerd. Big male female. I had a foreign exchange student from Kiev, and her father.
Could you speak up a bit, Frank?
I had a foreign exchange student from Kiev, and her father was a colonel in the Russian army, and he headed the artillery school at SUNY. And in discussions with him, just emailing back and forth, he said, I have a PhD in artillery from the University of Moscow. And, but only to 600 kilometers. And I thought, well, okay, I went to bed that night thinking, that's 350 miles, which would cover. So what is their capability now?
What, in regards to the range of drones?
Yeah, because he retired in 2000.
Well, the Russians have strategic drones, the ones that hit the city of Kiev. They have a maximum range of 2,500 kilometers. They can carry a 50 kilogram or 100 kilogram warhead. They do not have cameras, so they're pre-programmed course, although they're starting to find some that are shot down do have cameras, so there's the probability they will eventually be piloted by somebody somewhere. So they certainly have that range. The average drone has a range of 20 kilometers or so, but they're working, the tactical drones, but they're working on increasing those ranges to 30, 40, or 50. But it requires a bigger drone, requires a spool if you want it fiber optics, requires more battery space if you're not doing it that, et cetera, et cetera. So there are technical limitations in just turning around, snapping a finger, and getting a whole bunch of drones that have long range. But the strategic drones have extensive range, and of course the Ukrainians are using something very similar to what the Russians use. They didn't really go into that other than to say they're doing the same thing by hitting munitions depots and airfields and that sort of thing, and having, it appears, some success with that. So that's why I wanted to divide it up into two categories. Think of strategic, think of tactical, think of far, think of close. Those are two different categorizations. Who cares about the categories of this drone has this feature or that feature, or is made by somebody in Japan as opposed to South Korea or whatever. But the next thing you will see is fiber optic drones will become all popular. They are increasing that. The next iteration is artificial intelligence, which won't need fiber optic cables, but won't be able to be jammed. It'll be pre-programmed with what does a target look like. So it'll have burned into its chips what a tank looks like, what an APC looks like, what an artillery piece looks like, what a human looks like, and the difference between Ukrainian and Russian, however you do that. They will be pre-programmed, and they will go out and hunt on their own, and all there will be on them, their only restriction will probably be a self-destruct button or a recall button.
So Scott, what about satellite drone communications? Is there anything happening there?
Yes, there is. All the Shahed Russian drones are guided by satellite. And of course you think, well, why don't they just jam the frequencies? Well, they have 12 different frequencies. And as soon as one is jammed, it just flips to another frequency. And when we jam that one, it flicks back to the first one. So it has a degree of intelligence to it. And so at every measure, this is a war of innovation. Don't think technology. Also think of non-technological tactics changes and whatnot. In fact, the best comparison I found was one that you probably didn't think of. And it's the war against the U-boats. And you think, hey man, that's 1943 or something. What's that got to do with anything? But think about it. And it's also IEDs in Afghanistan. IEDs in Afghanistan, when we were dealing with them, and the U-boats and drones have one feature in common: stealth. Subs hide under the water, drones hide in the sky, IEDs hide in the ground. That's their main characteristic. And the way you defeat them is exactly the same way we defeated the U-boats in World War II, and we defeated the IEDs in Afghanistan. And that is having a comprehensive, multi-layered countermeasure approach. And just to finish up with that analogy or a metaphor of U-boats, is to protect our convoys, we had convoys, that was one measure. Then convoy escorts. Then hunter-killer destroyer groups to seek out the submarines before they got to the convoys. We had radar to detect them on the surface. Sonar to detect them beneath the surface. And we radio detected them when they sent messages, which they had to do in order to bring the wolf pack together to attack a convoy. Then we had airplanes in the sky hunting U-boats and attacking them on the surface, forcing them underwater, which slowed them down. But the planes had radar, and at night they used searchlights. And we bombed the U-boat pens, and we bombed the factories. That is a comprehensive, multi-layered defense approach. And the Germans couldn't match it, because everything the Allies did in the U-boat war to defend the convoys was strategically defensive, but tactically and innovatively offensive. A hunter-killer group of destroyers going out looking for U-boats, looking for trouble, that's offensive. The Germans were never able to get past the main advantage of the U-boat: stealth, submerged, firing torpedoes. Every measure they used during the Second World War was defensive to keep what they already had. The only way they could win that war was by building more U-boats. And eventually, by May 1943, it didn't matter. They couldn't get to the convoys anymore. They couldn't even reach the convoys to shoot at them. And Admiral Donitz, commander of the U-boat forces, said that's it, and withdrew all the U-boats because they were being sunk and achieving nothing. So it's kind of an interesting idea. You think of U-boats, completely out of date U-boats, what's that got to do with anything? But U-boats and destroyers and corvettes and ships are all technological platforms. So it's a war of technology and innovation. And who innovates the best, both defensively and offensively, will probably win. That's how we defeated the U-boats, and we did the same thing in Afghanistan with IEDs. We had so many multi-approaches to finding and destroying IEDs that eventually the Taliban, we even heard them on their satellite telephones tell us we're being defeated. IEDs are the only weapon that we have, and we're losing that battle. So we knew we were being successful. Exactly the same thing. Comprehensive, multi-layered defense, but offense when you can do it. Take the war to them. That's what happened to the U-boats. And that's the best way to defend against drones. And eventually, everybody will meet, and the playing field will now become level. Everybody will have the same technology, the same doctrine, the same tactics, the same numbers. And that's sort of why we have a stalemate in Ukraine for now. So, yes, Frank.
The real interesting thing is Natalia now has her whole family in Southern California. She married an American, and so her father is there. And he lives in a very nice town. I wonder what he does for his Russian army.
Army stuff.
Yeah, he probably don't know.
Could be. Anyway, yes. Yeah, go ahead. Jim?
Scott, do you know if the Canada-US border is being controlled by drones?
We said, I think it was Romeo LeBlanc said we had some drones on the Canada-US border. But you need a lot of drones to patrol the border. It's a start. It's certainly better than guys in trucks driving along the border and checking the fences. You can see a lot. So I would submit that drones would be very useful, especially on our border of 3,000 miles, 5,000 kilometers. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you very much.